NFL DFS is a daily fantasy goldmine. There are huge contests, giant prize pools, and the best part is, these are some of the most beatable contests in the DFS lobby, but only if you're attacking them the right way. My name's Jordan Chand, I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and in this video, I'm going to teach you how to beat NFL DFS in 2023. Now for this video, I'm going to be focusing on GPPs, which are the softest contests in the NFL DFS lobby and where we believe you should be focusing your DFS bankroll this season. If you haven't already seen it, check out our DFS profit plan video released earlier in this video series for a deep dive into NFL DFS contest selection, but let's talk about GPP strategy. To beat these GPPs, you need to be assembling high upside players correlated together in the right kinds of stacks, all while differentiating yourself from the field in your DFS lineups. Most NFL DFS players already know this, but the reason that they're unsuccessful in combining this correctly in their lineups is they're using glorified spreadsheets to build their lineups. And I'm talking about traditional optimizers and average projections. These tools only understand what happens for individual players on the average outcomes, but sports are not played in spreadsheets. You need to understand what the upside actually looks like for players and how an NFL game plays out on the field to be able to build lineups that exploit these high upside outcomes when they actually happen. And that's where simulations become so valuable. Our one-of-a-kind algorithm simulates every NFL game on the slate, play by play, thousands of times, and the full ranges of outcomes of players and their correlation to every other player in the game is calculated dynamically and accurately for that week's game. Now, once you actually build your lineups on SaberSim, this data is automatically fed into our optimizer, building lineups that resemble the kinds of competitive lineups you would want to see with your NFL DFS process. Now, this does not mean that Sims give you perfect lineups, but it means you can spend a lot more time on what matters, applying your research, looking into qualitative information about the slate instead of fighting with outdated software like traditional optimizers and average projections just to get playable lineups. So why am I telling you this? I'm sure you're sitting here thinking, Jordan, let's go. Let's build some lineups here. I want to figure out how to beat NFL DFS. Understanding the theory of why simulations are important are absolutely crucial to using a simulation software like SaberSim effectively. You should understand right off the bat when you sit down to build your week one lineups that our sims are already accounting for the factors you need to win, but it might not be entirely in the way that you're used to. It's ultimately important for you to just understand that it is accounting for these factors. So we're not going to go in and put in a bunch of rules that you would use on a traditional optimizer to build competitive lineups. The way you'll get the most out of SaberSim is to treat our sims as a baseline and refine from there, and that's really what the focus of this video is. The most effective build process on SaberSim is called build, review, revise. Now you're coming into the process of building your NFL DFS lineups with some opinions on what types of lineups you want to play. Some of you might have a lot of very strong opinions on what types of lineups you want, and some of you may not have as many opinions or none at all. On a traditional optimizer, you need to start programming in those takes right away to get lineups that look like what you're trying to play. On SaberSim, because we're going to build you lineups with our simulations built to win right out of the box, you don't have to, and in fact, you'll generally get a worse result and waste a lot of time trying to program everything up front. That's why our fundamental build process is build, review, revise. So you're first going to build lineups and see what the foundation of SaberSim gives to you. Then you'll review your build against your takes and your opinion on the slate, study the discrepancies between the SaberSim simulations and your own research, and figure out what changes you want to make. Then finally, we'll revise our builds here, taking advantage of the powerful control features that SaberSim has, fine-tuning your lineups to land on where you ultimately want to be. So let's get practical and start building some actual lineups here. If you've watched our DFS profit plan video already, you're probably playing a set of single entry and 3 max type contests and a set of 20 max and 150 max type contests. So for this build, I'm going to be building for my 20 max and 150 maxes. So all I'm going to do, as I mentioned before, is not make any changes beyond the 2 minor changes I need to make to abide by the DraftKings guidelines. From there, I'm going to set my build settings to what the contest I'm building for here is, which in this case is going to be a really large field 150 max contest. I'll update the number of lineups to 150, and I'm going to let it rip from here. And what SaberSim is going to do is it's going to go in our simulations for this entire slate and essentially sim the slate 5,000 times, giving me the best DFS lineup that I could play for each of those individual different slate outcomes. We'll end up with a pool of viable lineups that we can review and check against my research and my opinions on the slate, and then ultimately revise to fine-tune. Now that our lineups are built, we're in the reviewing phase of the process here, and I want to call out a couple things right off the bat. The first is that I told SaberSim I wanted 150 lineups, and that's what we're seeing here. My lineup's 150. But we've built a pool of 5,000 lineups, and those are all built from our play-by-play simulations. So that gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to dynamically make changes to the lineups, the set of 150 lineups that ultimately get pulled out of our pool. By default, the top 150 are the best 150 sorted by SaberScore. SaberScore is an algorithm that was designed to take into account the lineup's projection, its raw scoring upside, and its ownership projection to identify the best lineups to play for this sport, this size slate, and this size contest we're building for here. So this is an improvement over projected score, which is what most traditional optimizers use. And by default, right when we run the build, we're seeing our top 150 lineups sorted by SaberScore out of our pool of 5,000. Your goal in this step is to review the results of your build against your research and your opinions for the slate, and there's a couple useful tools to do that. On the players table, which is going to be where you're spending most of your time here, if you scroll over to the right, there'll be a few new columns that have popped up since we ran this build. Exposure is going to be your total percentage of lineups in your 150 here that contain a particular player. The pool column says what percentage of lineups in your entire pool contain a particular player, and the leverage column is going to say your exposure minus the ownership projection for a player, basically letting you know how much over or under the field you are on a particular guy. I prefer to review my lineups with what I call the right to left approach. So that means for these 4 tabs, players, team stacks, game stacks, and stack exposure, I go right to left here, looking at my stacks first, then team and game stacks, and then finally player exposures. The reason I like that is it lets you look at lineups through the widest angle first. You're looking at lineups in the what stack do they contain first, then looking at what individual teams and games do they stack, and then finally what players do they contain. So what you should be doing is going through here and seeing, does this match up with my sense of how I wanted to play this particular slate? And right off the bat, looking at the stacks here, we are getting really nice looking stacks, and that's the correlation and the sims at work. These aren't just rules saying you must stack certain players together in each of your lineup. This is dynamically looking at the correlations between players. What this means is that pocket passing quarterbacks are going to be more correlated to their pass catchers. We're going to pick up on the fact that not every running back is involved in the passing game. Rushing quarterbacks may not be featured in as large of stacks. You'll want to start reviewing your stacks and make sure that this matches up with how you wanted to play the slate. A couple things that I tend to look for is avoiding QBs that aren't stacked with any pass catchers at all, which doesn't show up very often, but it does show up from time to time. We see 2 of those in our 150 here. And I'm also generally a little cautious of really large stacks like QB plus 4 and on. If there's things that you want to change or start making adjustments to in your lineups, all you need to do is set either a min or a max exposure or just uncheck certain stacks or combinations from your builds. I'm going to just remove the no QB stack and the QB plus 0 with 1 run back here to just get them out of my lineups. When I do that, SaberSim is going back into the pool and looking at the top 150 lineups sorted by SaberScore where there are no lineups where there isn't at least a quarterback stacked with a pass catcher. We can also look at our secondary stacks. Secondary stacks are stacks or combinations of players playing in the same game where there isn't a quarterback from either team in the stack. So a secondary 1-1 stack is going to basically be, and we can filter by these lineups so we can see a couple of them here, it's going to be 2 players playing in the same game without a quarterback there. So if we look here, it looks like this one is Tyreek Hill and Keenan Allen playing in the same game here. This is a secondary 1-1 stack. A secondary 2 stack means that it is 2 players on the same team without the quarterback in that particular build. Once you're happy with your stack exposure here, or your stack type exposure, you can start looking at team stacks and game stacks here. Again, looking for discrepancies between what games and teams SaberSim likes and what your research and your takes on the slate led you to. And really, it shouldn't be all the way in one direction or the other. We don't want you to abandon all of your research and all of your stances just because SaberSim says they want you to go all in on a particular team. But also, if there's a team popping up in our simulations that wasn't on your radar before, you shouldn't completely ignore that. In general, when you find discrepancies between the teams you liked and the ones SaberSim liked, they're good opportunities to just look a little further into those situations and ultimately figure out where on the spectrum you want to end up with your exposure to those teams. Obviously, the Chargers have the highest team total on the week, and I think a lot of people are going to be on them here, but maybe you're looking at Tampa Bay as a team that I wasn't planning on getting some exposure there, and I'm a little bit surprised to see why they're popping up. We could cap our exposure to Tampa Bay and still make sure we're getting over the field on this particular team, but maybe bring their exposure down to allow some stacks to show up of teams that showed up more in your individual research. Once you're happy with the overall direction of your stacks, you can then, of course, continue on to the player exposures, studying your player exposures to see who you're getting the most exposure to, what players you're not getting any exposure to at all, and make your adjustments from there. One thing that I do like to do here in this step is to look at 95th percentiles, especially for players that are not quarterbacks here, so looking at basically all the skill position players. So I'm going to show you how to quickly filter out quarterbacks and defenses here. And this is just a little trick that I like to do in my process here, is go in and look at the top 95th percentile players. And I'm actually going to drag this over next to the ownership projection here. So we have 95th, and we'll put this next to the ownership projection. And just look to see, are there any players with a very high 95th percentile that look pretty low owned? Christian McCaffrey and Josh Jacobs jump out to me right out of the gate here. You can see their 95th percentile outcome is pretty close to a lot of other guys in this range, but it looks like they're lower owned options on this slate. I might try to get a little bit of exposure to each of these guys, bumping up their minimum exposure here to, say, 10% to make sure I'm seeing some of those guys in my build. Actually, it looks like we're already getting Josh Jacobs, so we're good there. Some of those lower owned plays that have some high upside in my builds. The way you should really be thinking about this overall is you should be combining what you're getting from the Sims with your research to provide SaberSim a high-level direction for the slate, letting our simulations fill in the minor details of how those lineups come together. Again, doesn't necessarily need to be that you blindly follow what our Sims say, and it also shouldn't be that you're just going all in on your research and ignoring the Sims completely. Finding a nice middle ground there is the best way to go. Now, I do want to address the question of what happens if you hit a wall. At some time in your process, you're likely to see a message that SaberSim can't reach your desired exposures. Let's see if I can go ahead and recreate that here. We're not getting very much Houston in our pool here, so let's say I decide I want to play extremely contrarian and get 50% Houston stacks in my builds. What we're going to see is a message pop up that says we're unable to meet the exposures here. What this means is there are not 150 lineups in our pool of 5,000 that match everything we've set here. SaberSim is going to do the best it can to get as close as possible here. And you can see all 10 lineups of Houston stacks that were in our pool are now showing up in our 150, and SaberSim's doing the best it can to meet everything we want it to do. However, at any time in a build process, you can start a new build with SaberSim using all the settings you've already put in place so far, and you can do that in the upper right here by clicking Rebuild Lineups. You'll get a notification that says we're going to trash the lineups you already have and start over using your settings you've applied here now as a baseline. And you can go through this process of iterating, making changes. When you hit a wall, rebuild using the work you've done so far, and continue to build lineups and dial in and fine tune. If you are repeatedly running into a wall here and you are seeing that message over and over again, or just want a ton of control over each detail of your lineups, you'd probably rather build on optimizer mode, which is going to turn off some of the more powerful parts of our simulation data, but allow you to build lineups on SaberSim like a traditional optimizer, setting randomness rules and lineup rules to create stacks and groups to make sure that your lineups are exactly the way you want. So if you're running into trouble getting lineups that you like following this process, first, try to rebuild your lineups using your settings you've applied as a new baseline. And if you're still having trouble, it might be a good idea to turn it into optimizer mode here, set the rules that set exactly how you want your lineups to look, and build that way. As we're going through the process of reviewing and revising our lineups to fine-tune, it's also important to think about diversification. Diversification is crucial in NFL DFS. The player pool is massive, and there's a wide variety of profitable lineups that can be played and entered into any given slate. With only 18 weeks in the regular season, you really want to be spreading out your portfolio. If you're all in on just a handful of core plays, you're going to see pretty massive swings to your bankroll over the course of the season, and unless your entire core goes off, you're going to be probably bricking most slates. slates. I like to play a very diversified portfolio, and the best tool to do that is the Min Uniques tool here. What this is going to do is set how many players must be unique when comparing any two lineups in your lineup set to one another. By default, it's set at 1, which means every lineup in your set needs to be a unique lineup. We can't play any dupes, which is a good thing. As you increase this, you are increasing how much lineups in your set must be different from one another. When we increase this to 2, we're saying each lineup in our 150 when comparing to any other lineup must be 2 players different. As we continue to increase this, we're diversifying our portfolio, and as you're going through this process, you'll often see your exposure to each player and stack go down a little bit. What we're doing is we are spreading out here and not putting all of our eggs into one basket and getting exposure to different kinds of lineups. Typically, what I like to do is set this as high as it can go where I'm still getting the number of lineups that I need for this contest. So in this case, 150 here, and I'll just set this until I'm not getting 150 lineups anymore and just get a sense of where that line actually is. In this case, it looks like that line is at about 7. At 7, at least, it can't reach my desired exposures anymore here. So let's keep going here and just see. I'm curious. So you can see at 8, it only has 30 lineups in our pool where we're actually able to get 8 players different from one another. And at 7, it wasn't able to meet my desired exposure. So the true max here to me is about 6, and I like to set this 1 less than the maximum here. So I'm going to set this equal to 5. And what this will do is this will give you a nice balance of being very diversified in your pool while still playing great lineups from your set of 5,000. And if we look again at that leverage column, you'll see it's not as if we're not taking any stands on this slate anymore. We're still getting a ton of Tyreek Hill, one of our favorite plays on the slate. We're getting a lot of Josh Jacobs. We're getting a lot of Charger stacks. We're still taking stands in the negative direction as well. Some of our biggest fades on the slate include Devontae Adams, which makes sense if we're playing so much Josh Jacobs. We're taking a pretty big stand on Joe Mixon, Amari Cooper, Bijan Robinson. Diversifying doesn't necessarily mean you're not taking any stands. It just means you're playing a more balanced risk portfolio in your lineups for that slate. And finally, you should think about this process as iterative, which means once you go through the process one time of taking the right to left approach to dial in your stacks, your team stacks, your players, and diversifying with min uniques, you should go back through that process and make sure you're still happy with the results. So now that I've diversified with min uniques, I want to make sure I'm still playing the stacks I like, which I'm happy with the way that this looks. I want to go back and check my team stacks and make sure I'm still getting exposure to the teams I want to play, and all of my stands are still in place here. And it's worth going and taking a look at your player exposure again as well, and making sure that nothing is taking you by surprise or has dramatically changed here. As you continue to make changes, keep going back through the process, and you'll find that you are fine-tuning and continually iterating on these lineups before you arrive at a set that you're happy with. Now, if you're following our DFS profit plan again, you'll end up going through this process basically twice. Once for your 20 max and 150 max contests, and then again for your single entry and 3 max contests. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and save these entries into my 20 max and 150, and then I'll show you how I would do that again for my single entry and 3 maxes. So once I'm happy with these lineups here, I'm going to click Save to My Contest, and it's going to pull up all the entries I'm playing on this particular slate. You can see my 20 max and 150 max here. That is 170, 190. So I actually have 210 lineups going into my 20 max and 150 maxes. So I'm going to change my number of lineups to 210 and make sure that this still works good with my min uniques. It does. And now I'm going to save these, selecting only my 150 maxes and 20 maxes. And I'm putting a unique lineup from my pool into each of these here. A unique lineup from my set into each of these entries here. I'll go ahead and click Save to Contests. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another build here, and this is going to be for my single entry and 3 maxes. If you want to play the same direction on the slate and you want your exposures that you set in one build from another to still apply, you can instead right-click and click Clone, which will carry over the settings from your previous build into the new build. But I want to start fresh. I don't necessarily know for sure that I want to use the same strategy in my 20 max and 150 maxes as I'm doing in my single entry and 3 max contests. So I'm going to start fresh here, and this time all I'm going to do is instead change the settings so that they match up for a single entry and about a 25,000 person contest, which is what most of my single entries are here. I'm going to make 2 changes again to my projections and start another build here. And this is ultimately going to become my build for my single entry and 3 max contests. Now that's the basic process for using SaberSim effectively for your NFL DFS lineups, but I do want to touch briefly on our powerful contest sims. If you're on the SaberSim Ultimate plan, you have access to contest sims, which will allow you to take each lineup in your pool of 5,000 and simulate it in a proxy contest that resembles the one that you're ultimately going to enter it into on the slate. This is ultimately going to leave you with a much more powerful sorting method. Instead of using SaberScore, which is still a good approximation of lineup quality, you're directly using the ROI, or the risk-adjusted ROI of your lineups, to determine what the optimal ones are to play in your contests. So let's quickly walk through the steps that I'm using for my contest sims for this season of NFL. The first thing you'll want to do is go into your contest tab, and we're going to create the settings for our contest sims that we're going to use. What I'm doing is I'm going to pick one representative contest for my 20 max and 150 maxes, and another representative contest for my single entry and 3 maxes. What I found in my experience so far with contest sims is that the general strategy and the payout structures of those contests are similar enough that the results of your contest sims will be about the same even if you broke it up contest by contest. So what I mean specifically here is I'm going to go to all contests, and I'm going to use the mini max as my contest sim for all of my 20 max and 150 max contests. So I'm going to find the mini max, I'm going to right click it and click add to contest sim. It's going to automatically fill in the correct settings to use for this contest sim, and I'll just go ahead and click save settings. Now I'm going to find one here I'm going to use the $5 single entry as my $5 single entry as my sim for the single entry. So we'll find that. We find the huddle here, and I'm going to go ahead and add a contest sim for that as well. So we'll go ahead and click Save Settings. Now I can go back to each of my builds, and I want to simulate the lineups that I've ended up with here against these different contest sim settings. So all I need to do is click Run Contest Sim here. And what this is going to do is this is going to take each lineup in my pool and simulate it in the mini-max here and figure out what are the best lineups to play in that particular contest. So we'll give this a second to run. Now that our contest sim is complete, we'll see under our lineups we've got some new metrics here, which is going to be the ROI, the risk-adjusted ROI, which takes into account the downside of the lineup not cashing, along with the upside of that lineup potentially winning first or cashing, the win rate, how often it's winning in our sims, the cash rate, how often it's cashing in our sims, and the standard deviation of the ROI. All you really need to do here is make sure in your sorting method, you're selecting the risk-adjusted ROI for the contest that you used for this particular build. So I'm using the mini-max as my proxy contest for this 20 max and 150 max build. I'll switch to risk-adjusted ROI for this build. And again, your process here otherwise is the same. What you're ultimately doing here is just making sure that you're going through and basically following the exact same process. You're doing your review and your revise. You're just using a better sorting method here to identify the best lineups to play. You'd ultimately want to save these to your contest following the same steps we did before here, and then do the same for your single entry and 3 max contests. But in that case, you're going to be using the single entry risk-adjusted ROI as your sorting method. Now, last but not least, we need to talk about late swap. The slate is not over once the early games lock. There are always afternoon games in the later slates, and a lot of times there'll be a little bit of injury news that we're waiting on for NFL. Fortunately, NFL news is pretty easy. We always get the inactives report for each game on the slate about 90 minutes before the game kicks off, and we'll run our final simulations for each game on the slate 60 minutes before games kick off. So typically, you just want to keep an eye on your builds around an hour before the afternoon games are starting and double check and be ready to late swap if needed. The first thing I always do when I come back to late swap is check to see if the red lightning bolt is on. We'll go ahead here and simulate that just so you can see what it looks like by putting Tyreek Hill's projection to 0. If this red lightning bolt is on, it means a player in your entries file has since been ruled out of the slate. And the first thing you always want to do is click this and swap the player that's out to the best available player we can put in. What that's going to do is go into each of your lineups, put in the best, highest projected player into the spot that Tyreek Hill was in this case, in all of your entries. And from there, you can click apply and download a new entries file here in the upper left where that player that has been ruled out will not be in your lineups anymore. This will avoid the risk of getting a 0, which is the most important thing you're trying to avoid when you're late swapping. From there, what you'll want to do is actually run a late swap build, which will rebuild your lineups using the new simulations around all of the players who have already locked into their games. The way you'll want to do that is find your original build and right-click it and click Create Late Swap. It's not showing up right now because I'm recording this when the slate's not actually in progress, but if you right-click on the build, click Create Late Swap, it'll create a new build for you using your settings you were using originally in that build, but it'll be ready to be late swapped, and you can run the build from there and go through the same process otherwise of reviewing and revising and finally uploading your entries file. I typically like to do that for both my single entry and my 20 max and 150 max. Again, because we're typically not under the gun and short on time in NFL, you'll have at least an hour to run your final late swaps and react to any late news in the afternoon games. And that's it. Those are the fundamentals you need to be successful this DFS season. Remember, simulations go above and beyond what traditional optimizers and average projections can do because we understand the way that football games are actually played, how players reach their upside outcomes, how often that happens, and what players are correlated to one another as those outcomes are taking place. You should be combining our simulations with your research and takes on the slate using the build, review, revise approach, going through and looking for discrepancies between the sims and your stances here and applying your opinions along the way. If you'd like to give our powerful simulations a shot for this NFL season, we have a free 5-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com, and we reset everyone's trial for the start of this NFL season. So if you've tried us out in the past and want to check us out again for this season, you can get signed up with a new free trial today. If you have questions about anything I talked about here in this video or anything else related to NFL strategy, you can always reach out in our Discord server or by emailing us at support@SaberSim.com. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Good luck this season.